Reactions to taxation. So, as we already covered in our previous installments, the French Indian War left Great Britain with a massive amount of war debt that it needed to pay down. And their method of trying to get this was to increase taxes on the entire empire, including the colonies. Now we're going to look at how it is that the colonists reacted to the British intentions in this area. But first, some vocab. So, we got to deal with it. The population begins to divide around this time into two camps. Patriots, those who favored resistance, rebellion, and eventually outright independence from Britain. Then you have the Loyalists, who preferred to remain loyal to the British government. That's the big difference. Now, we're going to find Patriots and Loyalists all over the colonies, but the biggest epicenters of Patriot action are going to be in Massachusetts. Loyalists are going to enjoy a little more power in the South. Now, the first issue, as with any movement, is you have your peaceful reaction. So one example is delegation, sending a delegate, sending a representative. So even though there was no formal legal delegate for the colonies, they had no member of parliament to represent them, they did send Benjamin Franklin, who was a respected scientist and writer from the United States, well, then the colonies, my apologies, a little misnomer there, at this point still the British colonies, to Great Britain to lobby Parliament to remove the Stamp Act. It ultimately was unsuccessful, but it was something they attempted. Now, the other method was boycott. So many colonists boycotted goods bearing the British stamps during the Stamp Act. The other thing the colonists would do eventually is during the Tea Act, they would stop drinking tea. This would have long-term cultural impacts on the American diet. So what happens was, drinking tea, especially for breakfast, was part of culture, part of British culture, so it was part of early colonial American culture. So when, in an effort to promote political ideas of unity and resistance to the unfair parts of the Tea Act, which gave special privileges to the British East India Company at the detriment of local merchants and smugglers, the colonists decided they would not drink the British tea. However, their diet still called for having that hot beverage, especially in the mornings and in the afternoons during the traditional tea time, especially if you were part of the middle and upper class. So you still wanted that hot drink. So what happened was they began to develop other hot drinks. So coffee, hot water, but this time instead of steeping tea leaves, you're running it through ground coffee beans to produce coffee. Or hot chocolate, mixing hot water or hot milk with cocoa powder. And in that process, you had other hot drinks that began to become popular. That's why to this day, you will see that most Americans do not drink tea. There's a larger segment of Americans who will drink coffee or hot chocolate as their main hot beverage of choice rather than tea. That's a long-term side effect of these colonial decisions, is the general American aversion to tea. So why did nonviolence not work? Why isn't this working? Well, Parliament was not really concerned with the colonial concerns. One reason why is that the colonists had no representation in Parliament. There's no member of Parliament whose job it was to make sure they represented the interests of the colony. So even though a delegate like Franklin is coming and is appealing to Parliament every day for quite a while, none of them, it's not part of their job to represent the interest of the colonies. They're looking after the interests of the various peoples and various areas in Britain that they are elected to represent. The other issue is the second that the colonies try to resist the Stamp Act, they get into a power struggle with Parliament. Because they argue that Parliament is not allowed to make laws limiting their economy, Parliament isn't so concerned at this point with why the colonists don't like this new Stamp Act. They're more concerned with trying to enforce the fact that, yes, Parliament has the power to enact such laws. That's the debate. And so they get pulled into a power struggle, and at that point that becomes the main focus, not so much whether or not the tax is a good idea or a bad idea. The other issue, which I didn't bring up here, but it's kind of important to note, is, I brought it in the last slide, is the rest of the empire was also being taxed. So Parliament's kind of looking at this going, well, you're not paying taxes that are any higher than the rest of the British Empire. So why are you bellyaching? Why are you complaining so much? And so they're just not concerned. Like, okay, boo-hoo. So, when nonviolence doesn't work, the colonists eventually turn to violence, acts of assault, and acts of property destruction to try and enforce their ideas regarding the injustice of British taxation. So let's talk about the Sons of Liberty. They were Americans who opposed the British taxation policies. They worked by organizing boycotts. Now, this is not always such a sunny business, because many times they're coercing and intimidating business owners into participating. Many times they're scaring customers away from businesses that cooperate with the British or sell goods that are part of the British taxes. They also attacked and or harassed anyone who was enforcing British taxes. So if you were a tax collector, you could expect basically to get jumped by the Sons of Liberty. That's something you could look forward to if your job was to be a British tax collector or to enforce customs at a wharf, at a pier somewhere. Rest assured, there'd be some group of patriots belonging to the Sons of Liberty that were ready to lay the beat down on you. So, one of the favorite methods that the Sons of Liberty enjoyed, or at least the one they're most famous for, is tarring and feathering of tax collectors. Now, many patriot mobs used this, and the Sons of Liberty used it as well. Now, at first when you see pictures, like the one 2 slides back, where you see this poor schlep covered in feathers, looking like some kind of a weird feathery yeti, getting tea poured in his mouth, it seems kind of funny. He don't look so good. But tarring and feathering is actually a lot worse than it sounds. So what they do is they take hot tar. They pour it onto the individual. Then, while the tar is still hot and gooey, feathers would be applied. Now, that tar is burning hot. And so as a result of this, skin was often burned off by the tar. And whatever skin was not burned off would usually be scraped off when people tried to scrub the tar off of the unfortunate victim, exposing them to all kinds of disease. An infection would usually set in afterwards. Tar is not exactly the cleanest stuff in the world. And as a result, tarring and feathering was usually lethal. Most people who were tarred and feathered died as a result of tarring and feathering. Now, the Boston Massacre. So, what happens? March 1770. It's a cold March day. Now, it all began outside the customs house, which is where taxes taken from incoming merchant ships were being stored. A group of colonists begin throwing snowballs, some of which are filled with rocks at British soldiers who are stationed outside that building to protect the gold, the king's gold that's in there. Eventually, some of them even begin beating the soldiers with clubs. Soldiers gather around to try to protect their own. Their officers show up, but no one officially gives the order to fire. But someone does say the word fire in the course of the exchange. Soldiers open fire on the crowd. They shoot their muskets off into the crowd. Now, as you'd expect, soldiers firing on civilians, there were trials that were held. The British soldiers were actually exonerated of any wrongdoing. John Adams actually served as the defense attorney for these men, which is very interesting. That the second president of the United States, one of the men we associate most with the American independence movement, was actually, of all things, served as an attorney for these men. But why? He felt, in all honesty, these guys were not acting with any malice. They didn't mean to. They got spooked. Tensions were high. They feared for their life. They did what was necessary to protect themselves and their comrades. It was just a bad situation. But the event would still have to mobilize even more public opinion against Britain. So what happens? What's the outcome of the Boston Massacre? Well, 6 people are killed and 5 people are injured. Patriots instantly spin this as the name implies. They call it a massacre. You know full well that if the British had won the war, we would not be referring to this as the Boston Massacre. We'd be referring to this as the Boston Riot. But they called it a massacre. These colonists were just standing there and they get brutally mowed down by the soldiers of British tyranny. Paul Revere's famous etching of the Boston Massacre is a great example. I'm going to show you that later on in an assignment, so you're going to get to look at that etching. Now, this also increases animosity between the British and the colonists. The British are pretty annoyed. Their soldiers are getting attacked by their own civilians. The king's gold is in danger. These colonists are rioting. What is going on in the Massachusetts Bay Colony? The colonists are infuriated. We don't want a standing army on our own soil. They send these guys, they collect our taxes, they're putting our smugglers and our merchants out of business, and then when we dare to stand up to them, they murder us in our own streets. Now, 3 years later, a little over 3 years later, on December 16th, 1773, Boston Tea Party occurs. Now, patriots board a ship belonging to the British East India Trading Company. Now, remember, talk about the Tea Act. You recall, that act gave the British East India Company special privileges to sell tea without any taxes, making it cheaper than the untaxed smuggled Dutch tea, which would have put American merchants, American smugglers, at risk of going out of business. These patriots, those who want rebellion, they board a ship belonging to the British East India Trading Company. They dump all of the tea aboard the ship into the Boston harbor. Now, the colonists attempt to hide their identity by disguising themselves as Native Americans, perhaps in a half-baked attempt to make this look like it was a raid and not the act of patriots. So the reprisals, Great Britain does not just take this lying down. They are going to come back swinging. So what do the British do to these colonists? The Intolerable Acts. The Boston Port Act of 1774. The Massachusetts Government Act of 1774. The Administration of Justice Act, May 20th, 1774. The Quartering Act, 1774. And the Quebec Act of 1774. So what was the Boston Port Act? Well, it closed the port of Boston, right? Shut down the trouble. If all this stuff is going on in Boston Harbor, we're going to shut down Boston Harbor. So these colonists learn how to behave. No more Port City for you. The official charge with it was that it would not be reopened until the damages from the Boston Tea Party were repaid. Then now, one last thing about the Boston Port Act. This meant that British warships entered the area and kept other ships from entering the port. This is interesting because it constitutes an embargo. An embargo is very interesting because when embargoes are done between countries, it's considered an act of war.